The spread of truth in matters of general concern is essential to the stability of a republic. How can truth survive if force is to be used, possibly on the wrong side? Absolutely unlimited discussion is the only means by which to make sure that truth is mighty and will prevail. If all opponents of a war are suppressed and all advocates of a war are given free rein, is it not conceivable that a peace-loving president might be prevented from making an early honorable peace founded on justice? How can the citizens find out whether a war is just or unjust unless there is free and full discussion? If it is criminal to say the draft law is wrong, then it is criminal to say that any law is wrong. For the Constitution, we are told, is not suspended in time of war, but we dare not attack it or our form of government. It is conceivable under such a rule that a citizen might be a criminal who advocated the election of senators by popular vote, the adoption of the referendum, or whatnot. But probably such would only be the case in time of war, when he might thereby give aid and comfort to the enemy. Must we return to conditions which prevailed under George III and be punished for criticizing our government? Are we Americans big enough to allow honest criticism of the majority by the minority? In days gone by, it was held criminal to talk against flogging in the army. Nowadays, it is generally considered criminal to talk against Wall Street. Revolutions are not caused by freedom of expression. Brief of Plaintiffs in Error, Charles Schenck and Elizabeth Baer, in the Supreme Court of the United States, October 1917. Howdy everybody, this is CJ, your cowboy in the jungle and Renaissance man in this new dark age. And in this episode, I'm coming at you with a relatively concise one, largely dealing with one Supreme Court case and a couple of relevant primary source documents. And this is another one of those episodes that's not part of the Woodrow Wilson series, but clearly is connected to it and adjacent to it and relevant to it, because it comes out of the World War I era and the tyrannical censorship measures taken by the Wilson administration during World War I. This episode is going to focus on the Supreme Court case, Schenck v. United States, 1919. So the background of the Supreme Court case of Schenck v. United States happened during World War I. One of the first things that Woodrow Wilson got the Congress to pass as part of taking the country into war in the spring of 1917 was the Espionage Act of 1917. Which, the title, the Espionage Act, makes it sound like it's just about, catching German spies and saboteurs, but it was about much more than that. And the Espionage Act of 1917, along with the Sedition Act of 1918, were the two main pieces of legislation used by the U.S. government and the Wilson administration to prosecute Americans for saying and expressing the wrong things during World War I. And in the case that ultimately culminated in Schenck v. United States, it was the Espionage Act of 1917 that was invoked. The relevant section is Section 3 of the Espionage Act of 1917, which reads, and I quote, "Whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully make or convey false reports or false statements with intent to interfere with the operation or success of the military or naval forces of the United States, or to promote the success of its enemies, and whoever, when the United States is at war, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval forces of the United States, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States to the injury of the service of the United States, shall be punished by a fine of not more than $10,000, or imprisonment for not more than 20 years or both, end quote. A $10,000 fine in 1917 is no joke. And obviously, prison up to 20 years is no joke either. Now, if you were paying attention when I read that quote, you will see that there was a clause saying, make or convey false reports. So there's a potential loophole to go after people for alleged misinformation. But the key part that was invoked against people who spoke out against the war and against the draft and things like this during World War I was the part that says, shall willfully cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty, or shall willfully obstruct the recruiting or enlistment service of the United States. So that clause was interpreted by those enforcing it, the Wilson administration's Justice Department, to mean if you give an anti-war speech, and there's the possibility that there might be military-aged, draft-eligible young men in the office hearing this anti-war speech, then your words might have the effect of persuading them to not volunteer when they were going to go volunteer, or to try to dodge the draft if they're about to be drafted. And that was the justification for interpreting the Espionage Act of 1917 as essentially penalizing any speech regarding the war or any issues related to the war that the government doesn't like. They can always just say, well, yes, you are expressing a political opinion that you're skeptical of why we're in this war and all that, but right now that's a crime because by you expressing those opinions, you might cause young men who are about to volunteer or who are about to be drafted to, in one way or another, try to resist, being part of the war and supporting the war effort. And the Sedition Act of 1918 put even more into this overall idea, added even more things that could be considered criminal speech and criminal expression. So there were several Supreme Court cases that came out of the enforcement of these laws, and you would think that, if you just read the First Amendment, it's arguably the most straightforward part of the Constitution in terms of how easy it is to read and comprehend. You would think that anybody who has basic literacy and understanding of what words mean could read the First Amendment and then look at the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 and the way in which they were used to prosecute people for expressing political opinions during World War I and say, yeah, there's no way that these laws and the way in which they're being interpreted and enforced is kosher with the First Amendment. And as everybody knows, the whole point of a constitution is it's supposed to be the highest set of rules in the game. And so if the federal government passes just ordinary legislation that is tyrannical and clearly violates explicitly the Constitution is supposed to take precedence. That's just like civics class 101, right? But of course, you don't go to fancy law schools and Ivy League law departments and get your JD degree or whatever it is in order to understand what the First Amendment means. Anyone with basic literacy can understand what the First Amendment means. You go to fancy law schools and things in order to learn how to make convoluted arguments why Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, etc., actually doesn't mean what it seems to blatantly mean. So, who was Schenck and his compatriot whom I referenced in the opening quote, Baer? Charles Schenck and Elizabeth Baer were Socialist Party activists in Philadelphia during World War I. And while I'm not a socialist, I will absolutely give the American Socialist Party credit. During World War I, they were one of the strongest advocates against the war and against related tyrannical measures like the military draft and the criminalizing of free speech and all that. The Socialist Party was on the right side of all the key issues during World War I. And it's for this reason, by the way, that I've often said Eugene Debs is my favorite socialist in American history, because Eugene Debs also went to prison for saying things the government didn't like by speaking out against World War I and the draft specifically. But in the case of Schenck and Baer, what they got arrested and prosecuted for was printing and distributing flyers arguing that the military draft was unconstitutional because it violates the 13th Amendment. So for printing and distributing flyers, criticizing the military draft on constitutional grounds, these two activists were arrested, prosecuted, and convicted for violating Section 3 of the Espionage Act of 1917. Now, they then appealed on the obvious grounds that this whole thing violates the First Amendment. And before we get to the court's decision and ruling, let me just share with you some chunks of what their flyer said, because perhaps surprisingly, it is a Socialist Party flyer that I am mostly in strong agreement with. So, one side of the flyer reads as follows, quote, "Long live the Constitution of the United States. Wake up, America. Your liberties are in danger. The 13th Amendment, Section 1 of the Constitution of the United States says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The Constitution of the United States is one of the greatest bulwarks of political liberty. It was born after a long, stubborn battle between king rule and democracy. We see little or no difference between arbitrary power under the name of a king and under a few misnamed quote-unquote representatives. In this battle, the people of the United States established the principle that freedom of the individual and personal liberty are the most sacred things in life. Without them, we become slaves." Again, keep in mind, this is the flyer for which the government wanted to throw people in prison for writing and distributing. Back to the document. "For this principle, the fathers fought and died. The establishment of this principle they sealed with their own blood. Do you want to see this principle abolished? Do you want to see despotism substituted in its stead? Shall we prove degenerate sons of illustrious sires? The 13th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, quoted above, embodies this sacred idea. The Socialist Party says that this idea is violated by the Conscription Act. When you conscript a man and compel him to go abroad, to fight against his will, you violate the most sacred right of personal liberty and substitute for it what Daniel Webster called despotism in its worst form. A conscript is little better than a convict. He is deprived of his liberty and of his right to think and act as a free man. A conscripted citizen is forced to surrender his right as a citizen and become a subject. He is forced into involuntary servitude. He is deprived of the protection given him by the Constitution of the United States. He is deprived of all freedom of conscience in being forced to kill against his will. Are you one who is opposed to war? And were you misled by the venal capitalist newspapers, or intimidated or deceived by gang politicians and registrars into believing that you would not be allowed to register your objection to conscription? In a democratic country, each man must have the right to say whether he is willing to join the army. Only in countries where uncontrolled power rules can a despot force his subjects to fight. Such a man or men have no place in a democratic republic. This is tyrannical power in its worst form. It gives control over the life and death of the individual to a few men. There is no man good enough to be given such power. Conscription laws belong to a bygone age. Even the people of Germany, long suffering under the yoke of militarism, are beginning to demand the abolition of conscription. Do you think it has a place in the United States? Do you want to see unlimited power handed over to Wall Street's chosen few in America? If you do not, join the Socialist Party in its campaign for the repeal of the Conscription Act. Write to your congressman and tell him you want the law repealed. Do not submit to intimidation. You have a right to demand the repeal of any law. Exercise your rights of free speech, peaceful assemblage, and petitioning the government for a redress of grievances. And then it goes on to give the local Socialist Party contact info and closes by saying, help us wipe out this stain upon the Constitution. Help us reestablish democracy in America. Remember, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Down with autocracy. Long live the Constitution of the United States. Long live the Republic. End quote. As a, I don't even know what to label myself anymore, small L libertarian-ish I don't know, conservative, anarchist, a fan of markets but not of capitalism if capitalism means corporatism, or just generically anti-establishment and anti-authoritarian. Whatever labels you do or don't want to put on me, it is quite a thing when I can read an entire page-long socialist pamphlet and agree with almost every single thing in it. But I think they're absolutely right. And interestingly, I had already come to the same opinion on my own before I ever found out about this case or ever read the flyer in question. And most people, even if they somewhere in like a U.S. government class or a pre-law or constitutional law class or a political science class or a history class, if they come across this case, they almost never are exposed to what the pamphlet actually said, which is interesting. They're probably given very, very scant facts of the case and probably given just a couple lines quoted from the Supreme Court's decision on this case. But they're almost never exposed to what the actual content was that the Socialist Party activists were being arrested and imprisoned for. Because it's a very dangerous argument. The argument is that the 13th Amendment, which is what instituted a nationwide abolition of slavery, what it says is clearly not kosher with the idea of a military draft. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States. Well, what's the military draft if it's not, by definition, involuntary servitude? Like, if it's not involuntary servitude, then that means if someone drafts you, if the government drafts you, you can just say, no thanks. Because this is voluntary servitude and I'm choosing to not voluntary for it. And as horrible as it is to enslave somebody for the purposes of harvesting and planting your crops, how much worse is it, as the flyer mentioned, how much worse is it if you're going to be enslaving somebody against their will in order to force them into a war they do not wish to be a part of? In order to put them in situations where they may have no choice but to kill or be killed in a cause they don't even believe in. How much worse is that, right? I mean, if I gave you the choice and I said, all right, I'm going to enslave you, would you rather do manual labor for me, or would you rather be dropped into the slaughter mill that was the trenches of World War I? Which one are you going to take? The other side of the pamphlet makes an argument that's more religious in nature and leans on those parts of the Constitution rather than the 13th Amendment. So the headline on the other side of the pamphlet is "Assert Your Rights," and it begins with several quotes from the Constitution. Quote, Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution of the United States says, "This Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land." Article 1, Amendment, I guess it means First Amendment, says, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof." Amendment 9 says, "The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people." The Socialist Party says that any individual or officers of the law entrusted with the administration of conscription regulations violate the provisions of the United States Constitution, the supreme law of the land, when they refuse to recognize your right to assert your opposition to the draft. If you are conscientiously opposed to war, if you believe in the commandment "thou shalt not kill," then that is your religion, and you shall not be prohibited from the free exercise thereof. In exempting clergymen and members of the Society of Friends, popularly called Quakers, from active military service, the examination boards have discriminated against you. If you do not assert and support your rights, you are helping to deny or disparage rights, which it is the solemn duty of all citizens and residents of the United States to retain. Will you let cunning politicians and a mercenary capitalist press wrongly and untruthfully mold your thoughts? Do not forget your right to elect officials who are opposed to conscription. In lending tacit or silent consent to the conscription law, in neglecting to assert your rights, you are, whether unknowingly or not, helping to condone and support a most infamous and insidious conspiracy to abridge and destroy the sacred and cherished rights of a free people, You are a citizen, not a subject. You delegate your power to the officers of the law to be used for your good and welfare, not against you. They are your servants, not your masters. Their wages come from the expenses of government which you pay. Will you allow them to unjustly rule you? The fathers who fought and bled to establish a free and independent nation here in America were so opposed to the militarism of the old world from which they had escaped, so keenly alive to the dangers and hardships they had undergone in fleeing from political, religious, and military oppression, that they handed down to us certain rights which must be retained by the people. They held the spirit of militarism in such abhorrence and hate, they were so apprehensive of the formation of a military machine that would insidiously and secretly advocate the invasion of other lands, that they limited the power of Congress over the militia in providing only for the calling forth of the militia to execute laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. See General Powers of Congress, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 15. No power was delegated to send our citizens away to foreign shores to shoot up the people of other lands, no matter what may be their internal or international disputes. The people of this country did not vote in favor of war. At the last election, they voted against war. End quote for a moment. That's true. Remember, in 1916, Woodrow Wilson was reelected on an anti-war platform. The central theme of his campaign was, he kept us out of war. And the obvious implication of that statement was, and reelect him and he'll continue to keep us out of war. Now, of course, we know he had no intention of doing so and did not do so. But the socialists are correct saying, from the perspective of 1917, 1918, hey, the last time that the people had a big national election, they reelected the more anti-war sounding candidate. And they never did hold a plebiscite on whether to declare war and get into World War I or not. Back to the document, quote, "To draw this country into the horrors of the present war in Europe, to force the youth of our land into the shambles and bloody trenches of war-crazy nations, would be a crime, the magnitude of which defies description. Words could not express the condemnation such cold-blooded ruthlessness deserves. Will you stand idly by and see the Moloch of militarism reach forth across the sea and fasten its tentacles upon this continent? Are you willing to submit to the degradation of having the Constitution of the United States treated as a mere scrap of paper? Do you know that patriotism means a love for your country and not hate for others? Will you be led astray by a propaganda of jingoism, masquerading under the guise of patriotism? No specious or plausible pleas about a war for democracy can becloud the issue. Democracy cannot be shot into a nation. It must come spontaneously and purely from within. Democracy must come through liberal education. Upholders of military ideas are unfit teachers. To advocate the persecution of other peoples through the prosecution of war is an insult to every good and wholesome American tradition. These are the times that try men's souls. Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. You are responsible. You must do your share to maintain, support, and uphold the rights of the people of this country. In this world crisis, where do you stand? Are you with the forces of liberty and light, or war and darkness?" End quote. Nowhere in that flyer did they even explicitly call for civil disobedience. There was nothing in there about dodging the draft or anything like that, let alone going and, blowing up a local draft office or something like this. All the calls to action were either, hey, come down to Socialist Party headquarters to learn more, or we're just simply asking people to work within the existing system, vote for politicians who say they're going to repeal conscription. All of their appeals were to the Constitution itself, which is supposed to be the highest law of the land in the American system, theoretically. Of course, we all know that's nonsense. At least we should know by now. And I think it's pretty clear once you actually see what it was these people were arrested for trying to publish and distribute, that they certainly weren't guilty of misinformation. They were guilty of making a very articulate and potentially very resonant case against World War I itself and conscription being used to fight it, which the vast majority of Americans who fought in World War I were conscripts. Now, in the silly 7th grade civics class narrative of the American system, the Supreme Court is supposed to be the Batman of last resort when it comes to your basic human rights, your basic, Bill of Rights type rights. They're going to stand up when the other parts of the government are trampling your rights, and they're going to tell those other parts of the government, hey, stand down. You're clearly violating that citizen's rights as clearly stated in the Bill of Rights. And it's true that the Supreme Court will occasionally do that. But most of the time, what they end up doing when these questions come up before them is coming up with convoluted reasons for why, well, the First Amendment doesn't apply right now. Well, I know it says Congress shall make no law and there's no exception stated there, but we're going to assume there's all kinds of implied exceptions. So, as you may already know, or as you might be suspecting if you know how these games go, the Supreme Court upheld the criminal conviction of Schencking Bear under the Espionage Act of 1917 for printing and distributing the flyer that I just read you most of the text of. The Supreme Court unanimously upheld that it was not unconstitutional to arrest and imprison these activists for simply printing and distributing a flyer stating an opinion and advocating, working within the system to try and oppose what they considered to be, with logic on their side, an unjust law. I still have never heard anybody coherently argue how military conscription doesn't violate the 13th Amendment. I'm still waiting for someone to explain to me how drafting someone against their will to fight in a war they don't want to fight in is not a completely blatant violation of the amendment that says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States. I have never heard a coherent argument saying that military conscription does not violate that amendment. So not only did the Supreme Court unanimously uphold the conviction of Schencking Bear, the opinion was written by our good friend, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Yes, the same guy I quoted a couple episodes ago upholding eugenics laws in the case of Buck v. Bell. Yes, that guy. Same guy, nominated by Teddy Roosevelt, progressive president. Big-time statist, militarist, corporatist, progressive Teddy Roosevelt. Shockingly, here he is, defending a progressive violation of the Bill of Rights. Now, Justice Holmes's opinion is often quoted, but I'll go ahead and quote it here just in case you haven't heard it or haven't heard it in a while. Here's the key passage. Holmes writes, quote, "We admit that, in many places and in many times, the defendants, in saying all that was said in the circular, would have been within their constitutional rights. But the character of every act depends upon the circumstances in which it is done. The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic." End quote for a moment. Notice a couple of things. Number one, he's making a classic progressive argument, which is that what things, including even constitutional amendments, mean changes depending on time and place and circumstances. So he's saying, yeah, normally printing and distributing these flyers would be totally protected First Amendment activity, absolutely, but we're not in ordinary circumstances. So suddenly your rights are called into question, to put it mildly. But that line about yelling fire in a theater is often quoted and pointed to as, see, we have limitations on free speech. Here's what's interesting that rarely, I think, gets pointed out about that key little sentence there. It says, the most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater and causing a panic. To me, the most important word in that sentence is arguably the word falsely. Because what if a man shouts fire in a theater and there actually is a fire? Ah, now we've got a real problem. If he's yelling fire in a theater, yeah, it might cause some chaos and panic. But if he's yelling fire in a theater because there actually is a fire and for some reason he's the only one that's seen it so far, that man is not a bad person. He is not a criminal. He is not a troublemaker. He is a hero. He is making people who are unaware of a dangerous threat aware of a dangerous threat. In other words, if the socialists, who in this case are pointing out the mortal threat to fundamental human and constitutional rights posed by conscription and other wartime authoritarian measures during World War I in the U.S., if they're right, if there actually is a fire, they're the ones sounding the alarm. They're not agents of chaos. They're heroes. They're warning the other people in the theater of a serious danger that most of the other people in the theater probably don't see. And that doesn't mean that they're not right to try to tell people, hey, look, there's a fire. So I've always thought that was a very weak argument on Holmes's part, because even he says falsely shouting fire in a theater. Well, yeah, but who's to say that there wasn't really a fire that the socialist activists were accurately trying to warn people about? Back to Holmes's opinion, he continues, quote, "The question in every case is whether the words are used in such circumstances and are of such a nature as to create a clear and present danger that they will bring about the substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent." End quote. This is a get-out-of-jail-free card as far as the government violating the First Amendment. Because it's basically saying, yeah, freedom of speech and all that, except if there's a danger that those words are going to bring about substantive evil. He even uses the phrase clear and present danger, that they will bring about substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent. Well, who gets to decide what constitutes substantive evils that Congress has a right to prevent? Where is that in the Constitution as one of Congress's duties? And then who gets to interpret what exactly is or is not a clear and present danger to bring about substantive evils? Presumably, Holmes would say, at the end of the day, it's up to guys like him, progressive Supreme Court justices, who will just decide when tyrannical violations of basic Bill of rights are actually okay. Holmes continues, quote, "It is a question of proximity and degree. When a nation is at war, many things that might be said in time of peace are such a hindrance to its effort that their utterance will not be endured so long as men fight, and that no court could regard them as protected by any constitutional right." End quote. So yeah, just making an appeal that, look, this is an emergency, this is a crisis, therefore the government is okay to do things that normally would be considered tyrannical and blatantly violating the First Amendment. So as long as there is a crisis or emergency, they get a blank check to violate your rights. Well, I can't see how that could be abused and misused, could you? I mean, for sure, there's no way that politicians and government bureaucrats and administrators who are able to grab way more power over you during an emergency, there's no way that those same people would then work to make sure that there's always emergencies, real or imagined. This is the ends justify the means rationalization for tyranny. This is, yeah, normally we wouldn't want to violate your basic rights to things like free expression, but right now there's just such a dangerous situation. Well, normally you could criticize the government's foreign policy, but since guys are being drafted, we can't let you get in the way of that and maybe cause some guys who are about to be drafted to have second thoughts. When is it most important to be able to question and criticize the government? I would argue that it's precisely when there is an emergency or an atmosphere of crisis and hysteria. Because that's when they're the most likely to try the most egregious violations and blatant violations of people's rights. That's when they're going to be the most tyrannical. And it's also when the majority of the population is going to be least likely to question them. And that's when it's most important for people like the Socialist Party or the old school ACLU back then, when they were still good on these issues, before they became just yet another appendage of the establishment in the Democratic Party, as they have in recent decades. But back when the ACLU was actually still in favor of civil liberties, it was important for these sorts of people and institutions to stand up when it was most important, which was in an atmosphere of crisis and emergency. That's when the government is most likely to most egregiously violate your rights. And so Justice Holmes is saying, in the precise moments when your rights are in the most danger of being trampled on, that's when your rights are suspended. When the government is most likely to try to squash your freedom of speech and expression, that's exactly when your right to freedom of speech and expression gets put on pause, because we, the wise progressive overlords of the system, have decided that that's when your rights get put on pause. This is very much in keeping with a quote I've shared on some previous podcast episodes. I don't have it at the moment right at my fingertips, but it's from Frank Johnson Goodenow, I believe, founder of the American Political Science Association, another big progressive intellectual in the early 20th century. And he famously said that what your rights are is not some fixed sacred thing, like the dummies who wrote the Bill of Rights thought your rights were, but instead that your rights are just whatever is convenient for your government to allow you to have at the moment, given whatever the circumstances are. So your right to things like free expression get put on pause at the very moment when you need them most, like during a war. Or during, I don't know, a pandemic. How many of the blatant violations of the First Amendment conducted in the past few years have been justified by COVID hysteria while that was still at full peak? Furthermore, the establishment justifies all kinds of tyrannical, unconstitutional things in the name of defeating Trump. They declare Trump to be such a existential evil, right? A clear and present danger to the entire American system, that they then can justify to themselves and to the people at large. Oh, yeah, I know this looks like an extreme measure, of censorship and whatever, but I mean, we're literally trying to prevent Hitler from getting back into power. So, got to do what you got to do. This is the same ends justify the means rationale that Holmes cited here. And as a metaphor that I used to use when I was teaching to try and explain the problem, because like so many things from progressivism, Holmes's argument makes kind of superficial sense if you don't bother to really think it through. And I think that's why you're generally encouraged and trained coming up through the standard school system. You're generally encouraged and trained to not really think things through, to what they really mean, what the implications are, etc. Because it's one of those things, you just kind of hear it and listen to it superficially. It's easy to sort of nod your head and say, oh yeah, that makes sense. So somebody says, yeah, well, in wartime or some other emergency, yeah, you can't have all your rights. Yeah, we have to put the Bill of Rights on hold during those times. Well, there's lots of problems with that if you actually bother to think it through. I mean, aside from the fact that there's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly says the Bill of Rights goes out the window anytime anyone thinks there's an emergency, there's no clause that says that anywhere. But even setting that aside, there's the problem of if you tell the people in power, you get a free hand and a free pass anytime there's an emergency. Oh, and by the way, you guys also get to decide when there is an emergency. Guess what? They're going to decide there's an emergency most of the time, if not all the time. And they might use a war, they might use terrorism, they might use the threat of internal, insurrectionists, they might use the threat of climate change, they might use the threat of an economic meltdown, they might use the threat of a pandemic, they might use any number of things, real or created, or even imaginary, to claim that there's an emergency or multiple emergencies happening pretty much all the time. That way they get their blank check of authority pretty much all the time, right? Imagine you tell a prison guard, oh, there's all these rules and things you have to abide by when, trying to police your inmates. However, all you have to do is say the magic word emergency, and all of those rules and regulations that restrain what you're allowed to do in regard to policing your inmates go out the window. Like, wouldn't you imagine that the guard is just going to every single day when he clocks in go, emergency, and immediately start doing whatever the hell he wants? But then there's this other problem, and this is the analogy that I used to use back when I was teaching. The logical problem with saying that the Bill of Rights only applies when things are happy and mellow and there's no atmosphere of crisis or hysteria. That's the only time the Bill of Rights really applies, right? Again, sounds superficially plausible. But let's think about what it is. The Bill of Rights ultimately are a series of safety measures. They are a series of things that were pushed for and passed by guys who were reluctant to have the Constitution ratified and a more powerful centralized government than what existed previously be created. They saw rightly that the government being created by the Constitution was going to be much more centralized and powerful than the government of the Articles of Confederation. So understandably, the guys who were wary of that were in particular worried that this new powerful central government would transgress against people's rights more than the old one had. And so, as kind of like throwing a bone to those people to make them okay with the new Constitution, some of the Federalists, especially James Madison, decided to put together a Bill of Rights as a way to make those people like kind of ease some of their fears. To say, oh yeah, we realize you have some legitimate potential worries, understandable given we just went through the Revolutionary War and all that. You have some legitimate worries about what the new government might do. So even though we promise we have no intention of doing those things, us Federalists, just to allay your fears and suspicions, let's write it in there and make it explicit, which, not all Federalists were with James Madison on wanting to go along with writing a Bill of Rights. But anyway, that's where the Bill of Rights came from. So they're designed to be safety measures. They're designed to be like these very clear-cut statements of very fundamental basic rights that Americans would have. There's supposed to be very clear rules, very clear guardrails to protect you from potential tyranny at the hands of your ruling class. And in civics classes and things like this, you're often led into almost mystical, quasi-religious veneration of the Constitution. And people often will point to things like the Bill of Rights and say, look, we're a free country. And the way we know we're a free country is because we have things like this Bill of Rights that protect you from government abuse and oppression. But then those same people will very often, especially if they're progressive, which, if we're talking about in academia and the K through 12 system, they're likely to be. Those same people will also then repeat Holmes's argument, the argument of many early progressives of progressivism version 1.0, that, yeah, but that wonderful Bill of Rights that we love to put on a pedestal doesn't apply when there's an emergency. In other words, when you need it most, it's not there for you. Great. You know what that's like? I got this fancy new high-tech car. And one of the things really fancy about it is it's got the best seatbelt and airbag system that's ever been designed. It is the best. It's absolutely bulletproof. Why, you could plow your car into almost anything, any kind of crazy crash, and you'll walk out of it with nothing but a few cuts and bruises, if that, because the seatbelt and airbag system on this car is that damn good. The most brilliant geniuses in the world designed it. And you think, wow, that sounds like an awesome car. And then I throw in a little asterisk and I say, oh, one little technical thing you ought to know about this, though, before you buy this car, is that that wonderful seatbelt and airbag system that I just sold you on, it's always there for you. Always there for you. When you're in the car driving around, it's there. However, anytime the car is about to crash into any solid object, the seatbelt and airbag system of the car vanish. They disintegrate. They disappear. And they're not there. But they're always there for you when everything's cool. When you're driving around, normal speed, not about to hit anything, those things are there. They do disappear as soon as you're about to crash into something, though. So just thought you might want to know that. That, to me, is what you're talking about when you tell me you've got this excellent Bill of Rights designed to protect you from government tyranny, but it suddenly becomes null and void. precisely in those situations in which the government is most likely to go most tyrannical.